True RPGs are a sort of niche market and have their own hardcore audience, but as titles become more expensive and the industry tries to wrangle as much money as they can from each release, we find the line between genres blurred. Now, if you really stop to think about it, Mass Effect wasn't really an RPG, not a true one. I mean, it was a third-person shooter with RPG elements, with a huge emphasis on the shooting part. Mass Effect 2 lost the inventory system and loot drops, and Mass Effect 3, well, does anybody know what that was? I mean, it was a decent shooter with some character progression, but the dialogue was stripped down to only 2 real choices, and Paragon and Renegade choices were nearly non-existent. No meaningful choices. We find the things that are representative of the best parts of RPGs being stripped from games in order to expand appeal to an audience that isn't interested in the genre. I'm gonna take a look at Fallout 4 and ask yourself, is this an RPG? And if yes, what about it makes it an RPG? Are any AAA titles RPGs anymore? Most AAA developers have abandoned the RPG formula, and I intend to prove it. So let's dig in, shall we? So what is an RPG? In order to answer this question, we need to do a quick history check. The first officially published tabletop RPG in the West was a game you may at least know in passing as Dungeons & Dragons. But in talking with my father, who was one of the first groups of players in Minnesota when this stuff was winding up, he tells me that RPG was just a term to explain D&D and that they were playing some form of this game from small pamphlets that Dave Arneson printed, as well as less popular rule sets years before the coveted Red Book came out. At first, games were quick affairs. You always rolled a new character because at the start of the craze, it was unlikely that your character would even survive a previous session. My father loved to play as a neutral evil character because he was a goal-oriented player, at least that's what he said. He didn't like morality being a barrier to his goals. Or maybe he's just an asshole and doesn't want to admit it. You decide. This type of style is akin to the classic dungeon crawler rogue in that when you died, you stayed dead, and every new adventure was with a new character starting from scratch. Every time my father rolled a character, he gave them a backstory, and the origin of the character was almost always the son of the last character he had rolled. And it became a sort of running joke that anyone related to his first character was doomed to die in some horrible and random ways. Sometimes he would actually come across some powerful item and use it to destroy large swaths of the Dungeon Master's world, like a gauntlet of giant strength, which people may not realize, but this gives you the power to smash through walls and throw house-sized boulders. I mean, it's seriously OP and can demolish small towns. The damage that he would do to the world would carry over to the next playthrough. The world was persistent, something we haven't quite figured out how to do yet. Now, I remember he told me about a time when he heard a story about a creature that was being held in a dungeon, warded and kept prisoner by an evil lich. See, the Dungeon Master's goal was to have him go and kill the lich and the monster, but my dad was, as I think I've mentioned, an asshole. He decided to release the creature, the monster killed him immediately, and then carved a path of destruction through the land, spreading a plague that cast a black swath across the world grid that was no longer inhabitable. Food would no longer grow, and the family name of my father's character was cursed. Any new character he made from that family line would be attacked on sight if anyone recognized him, and eventually women would no longer mate with him, and his family line was destroyed. Basically, he was allowed to no longer make characters from that genetic line. Now, I know what I'm thinking right now. That sounds like an awesome fucking game. Why doesn't someone make that? Well, because it's hard to predict something so unpredictable as human imagination. Warren Spector said in an interview that his dream project was the single block simulation. It's his dream project to see one square block of a town be emulated where every door was enterable, every character had a routine, and the interactions were believable and lifelike. Can you imagine a single block sandbox where characters reacted to you in believable ways? Can you imagine the role-playing possibilities here in a world like this? The player-generated stories that can come from a 100% authentic single block simulation are nearly endless. So why do developers ignore the goldmine of ideas that can come from a game like this and focus on things like combat and the genre does not emphasize it, especially when the genre is still in its infancy? There's a pretty simple answer that I've gone over several times in my last video about Morrowind, so I won't go back over the budget issue, as that horse died a long time ago, and if I start beating it now, I would have to dig up its body. Let's explore instead the other reason. Player categorization. Players fall into a category based on their experiences and what they enjoy in a video game. These categories are wide and varying, and while there may be some cross-communication between categories, not all players cross boundaries so easily. A tool that is often used in game design is taking player behavior and categorizing it into a specific category of players. So if you're an avid reader, for instance, and enjoy games that tell a good story, you're put into a category for people who enjoy narrative-driven experiences. RPGs, adventure games, Uncharted series, stuff like that. If you're a player that enjoys competition and watches videos online about how to get better at such and such games so you can gain an edge over your opponent, you're in another category for competitive players, shooters, sports, etc. These categories do not typically cross over because these two players value totally different experiences in their games, even if they may share common interests. Now, there are over 20 or so categories that players generally fall into, but we'll work with these two for now. A competitive player expects gameplay that is varied and deep enough that through hard work they can gain a leg up on other players. Winning is the core goal that defines that player's needs, and mechanics that emphasize skill over, let's say, grinding are appreciated by these players. This is primarily competition against other players, which is why you see mechanics in Mass Effect 3 like the leaderboard and the online component that allow players to compete with one another to see who gets the most kills. This shows that competition can be about more than PvP. A story-oriented player wishes to be immersed in a story that takes them out of their life for a little while and takes them somewhere else. Observing a great story with great characters is a core goal that defines this player's needs. This excludes the ability to change events in a story or define the role the character plays. RPGs are only included in this category because they are typically story-driven. The mechanics of the game are not as important to this player so long as they facilitate and do not get in the way of the story being told. So in marketing a game that tells a story, you won't be attracting a whole lot of competitive players by telling them about your novel-length story, and you won't be winning a whole lot of classic literary fans to your short time-to-kill competitive shooter. So what does this mean? It means that to increase market share and attract new players to RPGs, you must pull from other categories to maximize profits. So sacrifices must be made. For a company, the conversation is rarely, how do we make the best RPG that we can? It's usually, how do we maximize our audience and give them the best experience for any given title? Sometimes this leads to innovation and sometimes it doesn't. So in the case of our example, you want to be able to strip away the elements that alienate the shooter crowd while not alienating the core audience of RPG players. This is why the Mass Effect games exist and is such a popular title. It's smart design that is aware of its audience wants and needs. If you go too far in one direction, you get a game that appeals to no one. This is why Fallout Brotherhood of Steel exists. But if you don't go far enough, you lose the audience you wanted to attract to your game. And that's why Fallout Strat-Edgy works, but doesn't work. And sales become less than stellar for your game. So how do you avoid screwing up and becoming interplay? The answer is through categorizing the needs of a player. And when you design a game, you ask yourself, who is my audience? You need to be realistic about this question because it can sink your game before it even gets off the ground. Understanding that if you made a straight-up, dialogue-driven, isometric, turn-based RPG, you will lose a lot more of your potential audience than if you were to go with, let's say, third-person action combat. This draws in the skill-based players. And once you know your audience, you can get a sample size, an estimate of how it will sell based on previous titles of both the blended genres numbers. The increase of your market comes from the homogenization of certain, what some people will call outdated, design elements that are stripped out to lure people from other genres to your game. So to illustrate my point, one of the things that gets cut in a game like Fallout 4, for example, is robust and verbose dialogue choices. First-person shooter players aren't going to want to read a whole lot of text, and fans of Borderlands like shooter looters will hate all that reading and get lost in what used to be a maze of dialogue choices. In an older RPG, it was possible to get caught in a loop of text if you weren't paying attention to what choices you were making. You had to read and search through the choices to find the exit from dialogue. Games now are designed with ease of use in mind, so that dialogue can easily be exited by selecting one choice a bunch of times. Skippable dialogue is made possible with journal entries that guide you to the point of a mission to keep players who are uninterested in RPGs from being turned off by one of its core mechanics, which, while still allowing them easy access to the content. Basically, you don't need to roleplay to play a role-playing game anymore, or even be interested in the story. So if you don't need to roleplay, doesn't that mean your game isn't an RPG anymore? RPG games typically emphasize strategy and grid-based combat taken in turns with many rules in place to simulate, this is the key word here, the feeling of being involved in a real fight. This type of combat is not fast-paced. It takes careful planning and sometimes trial and error. Players are urged to think about things like team composition, role of classes, what skills work against which certain types of monsters, and using a creature's weakness against them. Rule sets are usually tomes, and there's a ton of room for player growth. Think about a game like the original Fallout, where targeting a body had a real effect on how the fight played out. Crippling someone's leg and suddenly they have less mobility and you can easily outrun them. Shoot them in the eye and watch as they can no longer hit the broadside of a barn. Or do what I used to do and shoot them in the nuts and watch them buckle like a belt, screaming obscenities at you. But the type of combat has all been abandoned and replaced by more real-time combat that emphasizes movement, reflexes, and player skill like a shooter or an action game, because turn-based combat is frowned upon. There is admittedly a good reason for this. Turn-based combat can be boring for people who aren't interested in strategy games and want the outcome of the fight to be determined by their skill level, see Street Fighter, Overwatch, Call of Duty for example, as opposed to a random number generator, see XCOM, Baldurs Gate, and Shadowrun for examples of that. I'll be the first to admit that real-time combat, shooting mechanics, etc., they're welcome changes, but I find myself missing the deep, turn-based combat of a game like Baldur's Gate. After spending a bit more time with a game like Pillars of Eternity, the combat has grown on me, even if the story hasn't. But that's the thing, it had to grow on me. It's not something like a first-person shooter or a third-person shooter where you just pick it up and you just inherently know you're going to have a good time. There's something intrinsically interesting about a challenge that comes from your own skills, reflexes, and aim. Now let's talk about character growth for a minute. It's an integral part of a role-playing experience. It's deceptively stripped from the modern RPG. When playing a game like Mass Effect, it is almost impossible to notice a difference in your character when you level up, except when you gain a new skill perhaps. Because the difficulty scales with your player, meaning you never run up against a monster that scares you away and forces you to come back. It was designed to be a linear experience that could be experienced slightly out of order. Now maybe I'll make a video explaining my philosophy on this linearity of design soon, but to compound this issue, levels only bring simple stat increases, but no real change to gameplay mechanics. Whereas in Baldur's Gate, getting access to a new spell or a weapon that does a certain kind of damage, or armor that has certain types of resistances, it opens up entirely new strategies for creatures you couldn't even dream of tackling before. Rarely in a game like Skyrim do you ever feel like a super badass knight decked out in full armor, mowing through hordes of creatures because the difficulty scale's too high, and even though you may run into creatures that you outlevel, or that outlevel you, you know the only reason you lost that battle is because you didn't spend the amount of time required to grind out stats. In Baldur's Gate, it was actually possible through strategy, through good use of items, special armors and weapons, through a good team composition and knowledge about the monster, to kill a dragon at level 10. In most modern RPGs that AAA studios put out, levels do not deal with character progression, but instead with perks that increase certain stats. It gives you the illusion of depth, of character customization. The only stat you increase is HP, so therefore, how strong you are is tied to just your health pool and what perks you picked. This is not the same in Baldur's Gate. If you rolled a character with an 18-00 strength, you had an advantage the entire time you played, which at later levels with weapon proficiencies decked out in the best magical gear that you could get made you a veritable god. Modern RPGs have lost this feeling of true power due to homogenization. Weapons give stat boost. That's basically it. They increase some stats and make you slightly stronger. Look at Diablo 3's recent legendary weapons. or Path of Exile's gem system for an idea of what a magical item should function like. A magical weapon should fundamentally change the way the game is played by changing a mechanic or the way that a weapon operates. I remember when finding a +2 longsword in a D&D game was a big deal. It fundamentally changed how I handled encounters and made me much more confident in my character's abilities, but it wasn't exactly a huge change. I cannot, however, say the same for a game like Mass Effect. A competitive player craves the ability to overcome a challenge through skill, and this is near impossible when a monster like, let's say, a dragon, can kill you with a single swipe of its claw, and its sheer size and stats made it impossible for you to avoid. But that is part of what makes up an RPG experience, and I would argue that it is what RPG people crave. So in moving away from traditional grid-based, turn-based RPG combat, modern RPGs are resembling action games more. Since Fallout, RPGs have failed to capture the ability to change the world you inhabit. Fallout was an RPG designed to come as close as a dev team could to a pen and paper RPG. Since then, exploring the pen and paper RPG experience has been shelved in favor of melding with more popular genres. A game like Mass Effect does a good job at fooling you into believing that the choices you made have an effect on the game world. But the reality is, the choice is binary and simple, and at the end of the day, your choices only affect the aesthetics of the game and not the story. Take for example, letting the Council die at the end of Mass Effect. What effect does it actually have on the story other than that the Council models in the second Mass Effect are different, and a handful of dialogue has maybe been changed? Storyline and gameplay isn't affected, and as far as I can remember, no missions are changed because of it either. In Fallout, for instance, you can make a choice to steal a water chip from the ghouls in Necropolis and escape without fixing their water pump. The results of this on the inhabitants that when you return there later, they all died from dehydration, and the city was overrun by super mutants. Your decisions change the game world irrevocably, locking you out of other quests, at least in that city. Also in The Witcher 3, a similar thing happens with a tree spirit and some witches in one of my favorite sequences in the game, even if it doesn't actually affect anything in the game other than the aesthetics once again. Still, the result is more impactful because an unintended consequence of a decision you made changed the game world permanently, in that an entire town is destroyed. These decisions are intertwined in what make an RPG what it is. With the shift to more expensive and beautiful graphics engines, the prospect of having an actual change on the game world becomes an expensive proposition, and is instead stripped away in favor of dialogue choices that won't be there if such and such conditions are met. The change to the game world is insignificant if present at all and superficial. This comes from the fact that to develop these types of changes would be a waste of money in the eyes of developers. Why would you design a system that 70% of your audience are going to ignore? So in summation, the need to appeal to a wider audience is what's homogenizing RPGs to the point where they no longer resemble the thing they used to be. In this case, progress is actually hurting the genre, but sales numbers tell a different story. So what's the solution when there isn't a problem? Graphics, maybe? I mean, graphics can save the traditional RPG, and I don't mean bleeding edge, high resolution, normal maps and tessellation. I mean scaled down graphics. There's a game coming out this year that I think everyone needs to know about, and it's called Torment: Tides of Numenera. It's a sort of indirect sequel to Planescape Torment, one of my favorite all-time RPGs. There's no fancy graphics, no fancy anything. I mean, they look good. They just concentrated 100% on the RPG and gameplay aspect of that game. And they even included a playable video demo that gives you an idea of how far they're taking the RPG aspects of the games. Annotations will be included in the video here. A smaller studio with a focus on gameplay can create the game's a niche audience once because they're not looking to maximize profits with every game. They are not also huge and bloated megacorporations that move slowly on nearly every decision until they get a yes all the way up the chain. A smaller studio is able to see their creative dreams come to life a lot easier. The biggest factor here is that the industry reacts to you. If you as a gamer become more interested in interesting narratives than, say, interactions and emerging gameplay, the market will take notice because of categorization of player behaviors and give you more Uncharted's, because that is how player categorization works. But if you're like me and miss the gameplay of old school RPGs, you need look no further than the indie game scene. Buy more old school RPGs and the market will take notice. Allow games like Tyranny to rot on the vine, and the market will take notice of that as well. So anyway, I just want to say thank you to everybody who hung in there and listened to the whole video. I know it's a long one. I really wanted to make this video for a while. I wrote it a while back, but I just played Bloodborne and everything, and now I just played Torment, and now I want to make a video about that because I'm blown away by Torment. It's one of my favorite RPGs right now. It's probably the only game I've played in the last year, maybe, or probably the last 5 years, that has hooked me so thoroughly that I would play it for 10 hours straight if I could get away with that without feeling like a massive piece of shit. So anyway, check it out if you ever get a chance or if it's on sale. It's a very good game. I highly suggest you give it a try. So anyway, this has been a rant from Strat-Edgy Gaming, and now that you've heard it, go play some video games.